In letter 2, Screwtape picks it up a little further and talks about this rationalized behavior in more detail. He writes to Wormwood, all the habits of the patient, both mental and bodily, are still in our favor. Because again, these habits, especially if they're bad, will tend towards the rationalization of the habit. If you move the person again towards reason, then they apply the reason to the habits and they start trying to adjust the scoliosis of their life to the plumb line of reality, and they start to change and get better. But he wants them focused on the habits and the rationalization that follows on the heels of bad habits engaged in unthinkingly. Screwtape writes, keep everything hazy in his mind now, and you will have all eternity wherein to amuse yourself by producing in him the peculiar kind of clarity which hell affords. That particular comment is a clever comment and makes a point, but I think Lewis is posing here when he writes that. For elsewhere he has stated he does not believe hell is a place of moral torture or moral awareness. Nevertheless, he's just trying to make a point. Screwtape advises Wormwood to notice hypocrisy in others also, while remaining blind to his own hypocrisies. It's another problem, taking it a step further. A proper way to respond to such things, hypocrisies that we see, or people who even charge us with hypocrisy, is with honesty and humility, in the hope of awakening ourselves and others around us to the means of grace. Let me see if I can give you some examples. How many of you, in sharing your faith with somebody, have had a person say to you, I'm not interested in spiritual things, especially Christianity, because I see too many hypocrites in the church? How many of you have heard that one before? I remember what I used to say to people when they would bring that up. I would say, yeah, but can you think of a better place for the hypocrites? You know. Yeah, the only problem is the person that would bring the point up wouldn't laugh because they'd been burned by somebody. So about 30 years ago, I changed the way I went to that question. And I would say to them, you know, I think it's very perceptive of you that you see that there's hypocrites in the church. And I think you're right. And you know how I know you're right? They say, no, how? I say, I'm one. I'm one. I believe in the high ideal of love, but I've had sharp words, as I mentioned yesterday, with people I say I love most in the world. I believe in justice, but I've been unfair. I see the incongruities in my own life. So I know that there's hypocrites in the church, and I think it's perceptive of you to see that. With only one exception, in hundreds and hundreds of times, I've had that conversation with people. Everybody at the moment of my willingness to be honest with them about my struggle let down their guard. And they say, wow, when you put it like that, I struggle too. I say, what helps you? And now we're two honest people on the same path, pilgrims trying to figure out the complexities of this life. And they share with me that they struggle and they don't know if they've found something that really helps them. And I say, this is what I'm finding starts to help me. And I move to discussions of the grace of God, the love of God, the mercy of God, and the truth of God. I think that's helpful. I said to you there was one exception to this. I was on an airplane and I met the most Archie Bunker-esque person I'd ever seen in my life. And he was yelling at the flight attendants and he was yelling at people around him. His voice was loud and so on. And I happened to be sitting by the window. He was sitting by the aisle and there was nobody between us. And during the flight, I pulled out my Bible to have a quiet time. I hadn't had a quiet time that day yet. And he looks over at me and says, is that a Bible? And I said, well, yeah, actually it is. He says, you Christians, I don't want anything to do with you. There's just too many hypocrites in the church. And I said, well, sir, that's very perceptive of you. I think you're right. You know how I know you're right? And he said, no, how? And I said, well, I'm one. And he says, you should be ashamed of yourself. And it didn't go any further than that. The best laid plans of mice and men. But another example of this, too, Screwtape doesn't want us to go into those realms of honesty. He wants us to see the hypocrisy in others and not see our own deficiencies at that point, because we're engaged in the rationalization, the creation. Another example, I remember years ago, my best friend and his family hosted a German student as an exchange student the year that his own daughter, my friend Tim's daughter, was a senior in high school. This girl from Germany became a Christian while living in their home over the year. And at the end of the year, her parents were coming from Germany to pick her up. They had rented a motor home, and they were going to travel America for about a month before they went back to Germany. And my friend was worried that her parents might be upset that they sent their daughter to America, and she became a Christian while she was here. So he asked if I would go to dinner with their family. I was sitting at the table with the father of this young woman, and he was about my age at that time. This was many years ago. And I said to him, "You're from Germany. Where in Germany are you from?" He said, "From Dresden." I said, "Dresden?" And you all know about the bombing of Dresden at the end of the war. Berlin was already surrounded. I don't know if it was strategic for us to bomb that particular city. The estimates are 30,000 to 40,000 people, civilians, were killed when that bombing occurred. I didn't live during that time, so I don't know what it was like to have lost people dear to me during the war and what kind of anger might have been built up in my own heart. It's all so complex. But I think strategically it was something that was wrong. And morally it was something that was wrong. And when this man said Dresden, I looked at him and I said to him, "Dresden?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Has any American ever told you that he was sorry for the bombing of Dresden? It shouldn't have happened. Will you forgive us for what happened?" His eyes filled with water. And he looked at me and he said, "I wish my father could hear you say this. I have no moments in my life without knowing him as being bitter over the bombing of Dresden." I said, "Is he still living?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Would you tell him for me? Ask his forgiveness for me." And this man looked at me with tears in his eyes and he said, "Has any German ever said to you, the invasion of Poland that set off World War II in 1939 was wrong? Will you forgive us for what happened?" And all of a sudden the whole conversation went to a different level, where we dealt with real human issues of fallenness and sin, both individual and corporate. And we started talking about the necessity of forgiveness and the need for grace in our life. And before the conversation was over, this man was very grateful that his daughter had come to America and had come to Christ. Do you see where I'm going with this? Screwtape doesn't want us getting to that place. The place of honesty. Because the place of honesty, properly flowering, leads to grace and discussions of grace. Lewis and Tolkien both often quote this passage from Plato's Laws, where Plato says, an abuse does not nullify a proper use. A lot of times we'll point to abuse and we figure the argument's solved. But the abuse is usually the anomaly or the misuse of a particular thing. If we judge any segment of society by its worst examples, nobody could stand. And so consequently, there's always bad professors, bad students, bad used car salesmen, bad lawyers, bad pastors. We can always find the bad examples. But we find that we're moving towards Screwtape's inculcation of hypocrisy and delusion when we begin to dismiss an entire class because we're projecting, again, the bad example on the whole. In letter 3, this rationalized behavior moves towards blame. Screwtape advises Wormwood to redirect his patient's thinking towards unrealities. He says, you must bring him, your patient, to a condition in which he can practice self-examination for an hour without discovering any of those facts about himself, which are perfectly clear to anyone who has ever lived in the same house with him or worked in the same office. Screwtape advises Wormwood to keep his patient constantly irritated by things his mother does without thought of how irritating his own actions might be to others. At the end of the day, the patient has two visions of reality. The false vision of his mother, who is not as bad as the one he projects on her, and the false image of himself, which is not as good as the one he projects on himself. Wormwood is instructed to make that imaginary person daily less and less like the real mother. Again, Lewis says, I want my neighbor, not my idea of my neighbor. Screwtape goes on to say, when two people have lived together for many years, it usually happens that each has tones of voice and expressions of face which are almost unendurably irritating to the other. Work on that. Bring fully into the consciousness of your patient that particular lift of his mother's eyebrows, which he learned to dislike in the nursery, and let him think how much he dislikes him. Let him assume that she knows how annoying it is and does it just to annoy him. If you know your job, he will not notice the immense improbability of the assumption. And of course, never let him suspect that he has tones and looks which similarly annoy her, as he cannot see or hear himself. This is easily managed. And again, this is the kind of rationalization of almost unconscious behavior. It happens. We're engaged in it. But there's another kind of rhetoric Screwtape engages in, and it's the rhetoric of rationalized behavior that's intentional and dishonest. In letter chapter 6, Lewis allows us to enter into this particular topic. St. Augustine, wrote an essay on lying, and he said to speak a falsehood is not to lie. It has to be a knowing deception for it to be a lie. Anytime you got back a test paper from a professor in college and you had a wrong answer on the test paper, the professor didn't go through the exam and then next to every wrong answer write with a red pencil, "You liar, you liar, you liar." It was false, but it wasn't a lie. It wasn't a knowing deception. For it to be a lie, it has to be a knowing deception. How often we hear the word liar thrown around, different people accusing others of being liars. Yet we know people make honest mistakes, and sometimes, too, we mistake those people. Just like I mentioned, if I said to my wife, "You said this 2 days ago, I heard you." She said, "I did not say that," and I'd project it on her. I'd say, "Claudia, don't lie to me." That would be a horrible grievance on my part. I would be doing a horrible thing to her because I was the one who did the misunderstanding, and now I'm projecting that something is faulty in her, when really something was faulty in my ability to listen to her. Yet we know people make honest mistakes, and we know because we make them ourselves. And we would not like to have others call us liars in those particular cases. And now the deception, you see, is a little more knowing. We have no excuse for this kind of behavior. Screwtape writes, "Do what you will, there is going to be some benevolence as well as some malice in your patient's soul. The great thing is to direct the malice to his immediate neighbors." Richard Weaver, who wrote the book Ideas Have Consequences, also wrote a book called The Ethics of Rhetoric. And he says there's 4 kinds of argument, and they move to increasingly less ethical, till you get to the last one that really doesn't have a classification. The first one is the argument from definition. If you define a thing, you've got something that you can appeal to as you develop inferences from it, and you begin to make a point. And you can always go back and see if your inferences are consistent and faithful to the definition itself. The argument from the definition is the most ethical. You can't always get to a definition. We mentioned that yesterday. And consequently, sometimes we have to argue from similitude. It's like this or something. And so that's the second best form of argument. If definition means of the finite, God's infinite, when we do discussion about God, often we drift towards the realm of similitude in our discussion. That's fair. But the worst kind of argument, the least ethical argument, is the argument from consequence. And it's the argument we often hear in political debates. If you vote for my opponent in this election, the whole world's going to go to hell in a handbasket. We don't know that that's going to happen. We don't know what the future holds. And so it's an argument from nothing, and usually it's manipulative, coercive, seeks to build fear in a person so that they'll operate on the place of their emotional fear, which is projected onto a future that does not exist, rather than be something more substantive. Lastly, there's the argument from authority, and this one Weaver doesn't really classify. It's when we don't know how to argue, so we quote somebody else. It's like people who put out books like the Quotable Lewis and stuff like that engage in. That's a joke. That's a book I put out. Anyway, the argument from consequence is Screwtape's realm.
Yeah.